Giovanni Moretti had killed men for less than the way Roberto Ferraro's ring looked on Ginevra Conti's hand. He stood at the edge of the Conti Caress, a glass of untouched Barolo sweating in his grip, and watched the diamond catch the string lights strung across the garden, and something feral and ugly clawed its way up from the base of his spine. He was 36 years old. He had built an empire out of forged masterpieces and men who knew better than to lie to him, and in 36 years he had never once wanted to put his hands around another man's throat simply for existing in the same room as a woman. Tonight, he wanted exactly that. Ginevra Conti stood by the fountain in emerald silk that clung to every soft, generous curve he had spent 8 months teaching himself not to stare at, laughing at something her father's guests had said, and Giovanni understood, with the sudden clarity of a man watching his own house catch fire, that he was not going to survive watching her marry someone else. He was not supposed to be here. He was Salvatore Conti's enemy, had been before Ginevra was born, since a shipping dispute 2 decades ago had left Giovanni's father bleeding out on a dock and started a war that had never technically ended, only gone cold. Salvatore had invited him tonight purely to prove he wasn't afraid of him, a performance, a provocation. Giovanni had come anyway, because Ginevra Conti had walked into Giovanni's office 8 months ago with a folder of numbers and a spine of pure steel, and he had been unable to stay away from her since. He crossed the terrace before he'd decided to move. Yevra, her name came out low, rougher than he meant it. You didn't mention a wedding. She turned, and the surprise on her face flickered into something guarded, something that made his chest tighten. You never asked about my personal life, Mr. Moretti. Her chin lifted, defiant even now, even here in her father's house, wearing another man's ring. It isn't, Giovanni said, and the lie sat between them like a struck match, sparking, refusing to go out. His eyes dropped to the ring, an obscene, glittering thing, a business transaction masquerading as a promise, then rose, slowly, deliberately, to her mouth. 6 weeks? 5 now. Her voice had gone quiet. Do you love him? The question left him before he could stop it, raw and unguarded in a way he never allowed himself to be, and watched it land on her like a slap. 8 months he had buried this, had given her raises instead of confessions, security details instead of honesty, silence instead of every filthy, possessive thing he wanted to say to her, and it was unraveling in real time on her father's terrace, in front of 200 witnesses who would report every word of it back to Salvatore Conti by morning. He didn't care. That's the terrifying part. He didn't care at all. No, Ginevra breathed. I never have. Something violent and relieved moved through him at once. He should have stepped back. He should have smiled, said something meaningless, walked away before either of them did something they couldn't undo. Instead, his hand rose, unbidden, 2 fingers grazing the soft line of her jaw with a tenderness but had no business belonging to a man like him. Then why, he asked, are you wearing his ring? Because it's expected. Her breath had gone unsteady beneath his touch, her hazel eyes bright and reckless in the string-lit dark. The same way it's expected that you and I hate each other. Do you hate me, Giovanni? He should have lied. He had built his entire life on knowing exactly when to lie. I have never once, he said instead, his voice dropping to something low and wrecked, in my life, wanted anything the way I want you. I have spent 8 months hating myself for it. Ginevra! Her father's voice cracked across the terrace like a gunshot, and the moment shattered into pieces neither of them would fully recover. She had not always wanted him. That was the lie she told herself later, lying awake with his voice still echoing in her chest, that this had started tonight on the terrace with his fingers on her jaw and 8 months of restraint finally cracking. The truth was uglier and had been true for far longer. Ginevra Conti walked into Giovanni Moretti's office 8 months ago, expecting to hate him. Her father had spent her whole life describing the Morettis as animals, butchers dressed in beautiful suits, men who had tried to burn her family's docks to the ground a generation ago. She took the accounting position through 3 layers of shell recruitment, specifically so her father would never know, telling herself it was ambition, telling herself it was nothing personal, that she simply wanted to work for the best in the city, and Giovanni's books were, infamously, the most complicated in Rome. Then she had walked into his office, laid a folder of mismatched manifests on his desk, and looked up into eyes so dark and so utterly focused on her that she had forgotten for one terrifying second how to breathe. Your export manifests don't reconcile with your insurance valuations, she'd told him, because numbers were the only language she trusted herself to speak around him. Either you're underselling million-euro paintings to your own shell companies, or someone on your team can't do basic arithmetic. I'm guessing it's not the second one. He hadn't smiled. Giovanni Moretti rarely smiled, but something had moved behind his eyes. Recognition, hunger, the particular attention of a predator who has just found something worth stalking, and Ginevra had gone home that night and lain awake, furious with herself, wanting a man she was contractually, morally, and biologically obligated to despise. 8 months of watching him control every inch of himself around her. 8 months of catching his gaze linger half a second too long on the curve of her hip when he thought she wasn't looking. Of watching his jaw tighten when Roberto Ferraro's name came up in casual conversation. Of telling herself again and again that a man like Giovanni Moretti did not want a woman built the way she was built. Soft, heavy, nothing like the marble-smooth women who orbited his world, that she was simply useful to him, nothing more. There had been one night, 4 months in, that she still replayed when she couldn't sleep. She had stayed past midnight untangling a knot of falsified provenance documents for a forged Bellini, and when she finally looked up, Giovanni was standing in her office doorway in her shirt sleeves, tie gone, watching her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller than it was. "You should go home," he'd said, not moving from the doorway. So should you. She hadn't looked up from the papers, though her pulse had climbed into her throat. "You're not exactly setting an example, Mr. Moretti." Giovanni. It was the first time he'd offered it. "When it's just us, you've earned that much." She'd looked up then, and something had passed between them, thick, wordless, dangerous, that neither of them had dared to name. He'd crossed the room, close enough that she could smell cedar and leather beneath the ink and dust of the office, and for one unbearable second, she thought he was going to touch her. His hand had risen, hovered near her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth of his palm without the contact. Then he'd pulled back, jaw tight, and walked low and clipped. "Go home, Ginevra," and walked out before either of them did something neither could undo. She had sat in the empty office for 10 full minutes afterward, shaking, furious at him and at herself in equal measure, because she had wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, for him not to stop. She had been wrong to think it meant nothing. She understood that now, standing on her father's terrace with her heart hammering and Roberto's ring suddenly heavier on her hand than it had any right to be. Salvatore Conti did not shout. That was the terrifying part about her father. He never needed to. "You will explain to me," he said, once he'd steered her into his study and shut the door, "why Giovanni Moretti was touching my daughter's face in front of 200 guests. He wasn't touching me. Do not lie to me, Ginevra." Salvatore's voice was quiet, controlled, and lethal. "I have spent 20 years keeping that family away from everything I love. I will not lose you to a Moretti because you were bored of your engagement." "I am not bored of my engagement," Ginevra said, and the words came out sharper than she intended.
5 years of swallowed frustration finally breaking loose. I am suffocating in it. Roberto has never once looked at me the way— She stopped herself, but it was too late. Her father's eyes had gone cold with understanding. The way Moretti looks at you, Salvatore finished softly. I see. Father, the Ferraro alliance is not a sentiment, Ginevra. It is our shipping routes for the next decade. If you break this engagement, you bankrupt this family. And if I discover this has anything to do with that man's accountant position, I will make certain he understands precisely what happens to men who touch what belongs to me. She left his study shaking, furious, and more certain than she had ever been of anything that she was done waiting to be chosen. Word moved fast in the world Ginevra had grown up in, faster and uglier than she expected. The Ferraro family, it turned out, had spent the better part of a year quietly restructuring their entire northern shipping operation around this marriage. Roberto's father had loans out against warehouses he didn't yet own, contracts signed contingent on a wedding that hadn't happened. A broken engagement wouldn't just embarrass them, it would ruin them. And men who stood to lose everything did not, in Giovanni's experience, lose it quietly. The first bullet came 4 days later outside a private auction house on the Via Margutta, where Giovanni had gone to certify a recovered Caravaggio worth 11 million euros. He'd had a forger paint in a Trastevere basement 6 weeks earlier. Ginevra was beside him, finalizing paperwork for the shell buyer, when a motorcycle slowed outside the gallery windows and the glass exploded inward in a spray of glittering shards. Giovanni didn't think. He never thinks in moments like this. His body simply moved, hauling Ginevra bodily behind a marble pillar, his chest slamming against her back, his arms caging her in as his men returned fire and the bike screamed off down the cobblestones into the dark. For one suspended second, neither of them breathed. Are you hit? His voice was raw, frantic in a way she'd never heard from him. His hands moved over her arms, her shoulders, the thick curve of her waist, searching for blood with a desperation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the way his whole body had gone cold at the sound of glass breaking near her. Evra, tell me you're not hit. I'm fine. She was shaking, her hands fisted in his ruined jacket, adrenaline and terror and something dangerously close to exhilaration crashing through her all at once. Giovanni, I'm okay. He didn't let go of her. He pulled her fully against his chest, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in like a man who'd nearly lost something he'd never let himself claim. If I had lost you, he said, so quietly she almost missed it, because I was too stupid, too proud to lock you down and keep you safe? You didn't lose me. Ginevra pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hazel eyes fierce despite the tremor in her hands. Who was that? Giovanni's jaw hardened, the tenderness in his face burning away into something colder. Ferraro, he said, or your father, or both of them, finally agreeing on something. They know, understanding dawned across her face, sharp and terrible. About us, about the engagement. They know I want out, and they can't afford to let that happen, not with everything Roberto's family has already staked on this marriage. His hands tightened on her waist. Then let them know the rest of it, too, he said, low and rough, and this time when his eyes dropped to her mouth, neither of them pretended it meant nothing.
Let them know exactly what they're threatening. It should have terrified her more than it did, a bullet through a gallery window, her father's fury, an engagement collapsing into a war between two families who'd never stopped hating each other. Instead, Ginevra found herself in Giovanni's penthouse that night, her ruined blazer discarded on his sofa, watching him peel off a jacket with a graze along one forearm he hadn't even mentioned, and she understood, with a certainty that frightened her far more than any gunshot, that she was already his, had been for months, maybe from the very first day. Sit down, she ordered, retrieving the trauma kit from underneath his bathroom sink with the same brisk efficiency she brought to his ledgers, because it was easier to focus on his arm than on the way her whole body was still humming from his hands on her waist. Giovanni obeyed. Giovanni Moretti, who obeyed no one. He watched her clean the wound with dark, fascinated eyes, like she was the only unpredictable variable he'd ever allowed into his carefully controlled life. "You've had that ring on your hand for a year, and I have wanted to rip it off your finger every single time I saw it." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Her hands stilled against his arm. 8 months, Giovanni. 8 months of watching you watch me and pretending you didn't. Because you are Salvatore Conti's daughter, and I am the man he has spent 20 years trying to bury. Because wanting you was never going to be simple, and I have never once in my life let myself want something I couldn't control. His hand came up, catching her wrist before she could pull away, drawing her down between his spread knees the way he'd wanted to for months. And because the day I finally said it out loud, I was going to mean it completely. I don't do anything halfway, not even this. "Say it now," she whispered. "You are mine." His voice had dropped to something low and possessive, his hand sliding up to cradle her jaw the way it had on the terrace, except now there was no audience, no father's voice to cut through it. Every brilliant, infuriating thought in your head, every curve of you that men like Roberto Ferrara were never smart enough to appreciate. I have wanted you since the day you told me my manifests didn't reconcile, and I am done pretending otherwise. Ginevra's breath caught, months of buried want cracking wide open at once. "I fell for you the same day," she admitted, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I told myself it was impossible, that you'd never look at someone built like me the way you looked at the women who actually belonged in your world. There is no one in my world who belongs there more than you." Giovanni pulled her fully onto his lap, uncaring of the wound in his arm, his hands mapping the soft, generous weight of her like he'd been starving for exactly this. "I don't want marble, Giovanni. I want you. Every soft, stubborn inch of you." He kissed her then, finally, years of restraint dissolving into something neither of them had the will to stop. Slow at first, and then not slow at all, his hands tangling in her hair, hers fisting in the collar of his shirt, like she could pull him even closer than he already was. Whatever came after this, whatever it cost them both, there was no walking it back now. The betrayal surfaced 3 days later, and it explained far more than a single motorcycle attack. Ginevra found it like she found everything, buried in numbers no one else had thought to check. A pattern of payments routed through a logistics company that, cross-referenced against nothing but her own memory, happened to belong to Roberto Ferraro's cousin. Payments that traced back, disturbingly, to Paolo Ricci, Giovanni's second-in-command, the forger responsible for some of the syndicate's finest fraudulent titians. She brought the ledger to Giovanni at 2 in the morning, shaking with fury rather than fear, spreading the pages across his desk. "It's Ricci," she said. "He's been feeding Ferraro your shipping schedules for a year, long before I ever walked into this building. Your security rotations, the Caravaggio auction. He knew exactly when you'd be exposed outside that gallery." Her jaw tightened. "And I'd bet everything I have that he told them about us the moment he noticed you watching me." Giovanni went very still, the particular dangerous stillness of a man deciding calmly exactly how someone was going to die. "He sold my life," he said quietly, "to save a marriage that was never going to save his master's anyway." "He sold both our lives," Ginevra said, her hand finding his, lacing their fingers together over the ledger, the same numbers that had first brought her into this office, now the thing that might finally save it. "Let me help you end this." Something in Giovanni's chest, the last wall he had left, the one that insisted he handle everything alone, just gave out. "You are worth more to me," he said, low and raw, "than every forged masterpiece in this building. I have run this family for a decade, Genevera, and I have never trusted anyone the way I trust you. It terrifies me. Then stop being terrified and let's finish this together." Ricci came to the palazzo the next evening, summoned under the pretense of reviewing a new commission, and Ginevra watched from the shadow of the study doorway as Giovanni let him talk, let him lie, smiling, comfortable, entirely unaware that the ledger sitting closed on the desk between them held every payment he'd ever taken. "The Bellini's nearly finished," Ricci said, easy and unbothered, pouring himself a glass of Giovanni's wine without being offered one. "Should fetch 9, maybe 10 million once it's aged properly. I was thinking How much did the Ferraros pay you for my security rotations, Paolo?" The glass stopped halfway to Ricci's mouth. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular silence of a man realizing too late exactly how much rope he'd been given. "Giovanni, I don't know what you—" "Don't." Giovanni's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. He opened the ledger and turned it, unhurried, so Ricci could see his own name beside a column of dates and figures that matched, almost to the day, every piece of intelligence that had reached the Ferraro family over the past year. A man who spent a decade painting other men's signatures should know better than to think a forensic accountant wouldn't recognize a pattern. Ricci's eyes flicked, involuntarily, to the doorway, to Ginevra standing there with her arms folded and no mercy at all in her expression. "This is her doing, the Conti girl feeding you." "The Conti girl," said Ginevra, stepping into the light, "found your name in 11 months of falsified logistics invoices in under a week, Paolo. I'd be more embarrassed about that than being caught, if I were you." Giovanni rose from his chair, and whatever composure Ricci had left him deserted him entirely at the look on his boss's face. "You sold the men outside that gallery my exact location," Giovanni said quietly, rounding the desk. "You sold them the hour I'd have my guard down for a woman I'd just discovered I couldn't survive losing. You didn't just betray this family, Paolo. You very nearly cost me everything I have left in this world that matters." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Take him," he said to the men waiting in the hall, and did not look back as they did. Ginevra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and when Giovanni turned to her, the coldness in his face had already begun to thaw, replaced by something exhausted and grateful and entirely undone. "You didn't have to watch that," he said. "I wanted to." She crossed to him, resting her palm flat against his chest, feeling his heart finally begin to slow beneath it. "I told you, we finish this together." They dealt with Ricci within the week, quietly, permanently, the way Giovanni's world dealt with men who sold their loyalty. Stripped of their inside information and facing a furious Salvatore Conti who had just discovered his daughter's engagement had been sabotaged from the inside by the very family it was meant to enrich, the Ferraro alliance collapsed under its own weight. Roberto Ferraro, humiliated and quietly relieved in equal measure, asked to be released from the engagement himself before the week was out. Salvatore, for all his fury, was above everything else a pragmatist. A marriage that no longer served his interests was simply a marriage he no longer wanted. When Ginevra came to him, not to ask permission but to tell him plainly what she intended, he did not forgive it, but he did not stop her either. "You've made your bed with the enemy," he said, weary in a way she'd never heard from him. "I hope for your sake he's worth what it will cost you." "He is," Ginevra said, without a single second of hesitation. "He's worth everything." She found Giovanni in his penthouse that night, standing at the window of his bedroom in the darkness, looking out over a city that had tried, twice now, to bury him. He didn't turn at the sound of her footsteps, but his shoulders went rigid, the only tell she'd ever managed to pull from him that said he'd been waiting, listening for her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough with something that had nothing to do with anger. If your father finds out, I don't care anymore what my father finds out. She closed the distance between them, her heels echoing against marble, and when she reached him, she didn't wait for permission or conversation. She pulled his shirt over his head with urgent, shaking hands, her palms mapping the hard planes of his chest, feeling the immediate, desperate response of his body, the way his breath caught, the way his hands rose to grip her waist like he'd drown without the anchor of his. Geneva. No. She silenced him with her mouth against his. And this wasn't the terrace, wasn't controlled or careful or built on 8 months of restraint finally cracking. This was raw. This was the kiss of a woman who had made her choice and wouldn't hear any more hesitation from him. Her hands fisted in his dark hair, and she felt him lose whatever grip he'd had on composure, felt the exact moment he stopped trying to be careful with her. He hauled her up against him, one hand sliding down the curve of her ass, pulling her hard against his body, and kissed her like he was starving, not gentle, not slow, but urgent and possessive and entirely, primitively desperate. His mouth moved to her jaw, her throat, leaving marks she didn't care if anyone saw. You are not leaving, he said against her skin, and there was nothing controlled about his voice now. Nothing but raw need bleeding through. You understand me. Whatever happens, whatever your father does, whatever has to burn, you are staying with me. I'm not going anywhere. Her hands moved to his shoulders, and she meant it with every fiber of her being, with the kind of certainty that frightened her less than it had any right to. You stopped pretending weeks ago, Giovanni. Stop now. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, his dark eyes almost black in the dim light, his jaw tight with the effort of holding himself together. If I don't stop pretending, he said, breathing heavily, I won't be able to stop at all. I will own you completely, Ginevra. Every thought, every breath. Is that what you want? That's exactly what I want. She reached for the zipper of her dress, and he caught her hand, stilling it, his breathing harsh and unsteady. Stop protecting me from what you feel. Stop pretending I don't see exactly what you are when you look at me. Giovanni's eyes closed for a second, and when they opened again, there was nothing left of the careful, controlled man he'd spent a decade becoming. There was only hunger, only need. Only a man who had held himself back for too long, finally, completely breaking. He swept her into his arms with a desperation that made clear every single thing he'd buried, every ounce of want he'd kept locked down. He carried her to the bed and laid her down, and his mouth found hers again with an intensity that stole her breath, his hands moving over her with the singular focus of a man claiming what was his, what had always been his. You are mine, he said roughly against her mouth, his voice breaking slightly. Every soft, stubborn, impossible piece of you, mine. She pulled him closer, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his shoulders, and when the dress fell away, when there was nothing left between them but skin and want, and 8 months of unbearable waiting finally violently resolved, Ginevra Conti let herself be consumed by the only man in Rome who had ever truly seen her, who had wanted her not despite her curves, but because of them, who had chosen her knowing exactly what it would cost him. The rest of the night belonged entirely to them, to the sound of her own name on his lips like a prayer and a curse wrapped into one, to the weight of his body over hers, to the absolute, unwavering certainty that whatever came after, the fallout with her father, the war that might still come between two families, the cost of loving the enemy, was worth it, as long as it meant she never had to pretend again. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more stories like this, do well to hit the subscribe button. And thanks for listening.